Daniel woke up with a sharp pain in his chest. Smoke still rose from the wreck of his ship, broken pieces scattered across the strange red soil. His head spun, and for a moment he thought he was alone on this alien planet. The air was heavy, and the sky had two suns, one bright white and the other a faint red glow. He coughed, pushed himself up, and grabbed the broken rifle beside him. The weapon still hummed with a weak charge, but it was cracked. He knew it would not last long. He looked around carefully, every muscle tense. The forest near the crash site was not like Earth's forests. The trees were crystal-like, shining faintly, and the leaves shimmered as if made from glass. A strange silence hung over the place, but Daniel felt eyes on him. He slowly turned and noticed small shapes hiding behind glowing mushrooms. At first, he thought they were animals, but then one of them peeked out more clearly. His eyes widened. They were tiny people, not insects, not toys, but living beings, each one no taller than his hand. Their skin was pale silver, and their big round eyes reflected the two suns. They wore clothes made of woven grass and sparkling stone beads. Their voices were soft, like whispers of wind. Daniel blinked, unsure if the crash had scrambled his brain. The tiny creatures seemed afraid. They huddled together, whispering quickly in a language Daniel did not understand. One of them pointed at him and shouted a word. The others gasped and ducked down. Daniel raised his hands slowly, trying to show he was not a threat. "I'm not here to hurt you," he said in a low voice. Of course, they could not understand, but his tone was calm and his posture was open. For a few moments, nothing happened. Then, one brave tiny alien stepped forward. It was holding a spear no bigger than a toothpick. Its little hands trembled, but its wide eyes stared directly at Daniel. He almost smiled at the courage. "Easy," Daniel whispered. "I won't harm you." But before he could take another breath, the ground shook. A roar split the silence. From the crystal forest came a beast, taller than 3 men, with 4 legs like a panther, but a mouth full of long, glowing fangs. Its scales were black and red, and its tail cracked like a whip as it smashed the ground. The tiny aliens screamed in terror. Scattering in all directions, the brave one with the spear dropped it and ran. Daniel's blood went cold. The beast's eyes locked onto the tiny villagers, and it lunged. Daniel didn't think. His body moved before his mind. He ran between the beast and the tiny aliens. His broken rifle buzzed weakly in his hands. He aimed at the monster's head and fired. A weak blue blast struck the creature's side, making it howl in rage, but not stopping it. The weapon sparked and died in his grip. Now it was just him. The beast swung its tail, smashing Daniel to the ground. He rolled, pain shooting through his body, but he clenched his fists and stood again. The tiny aliens were frozen, watching with wide eyes. They had never seen anything like this. Daniel picked up a jagged piece of metal from his wrecked ship and held it like a blade. The beast roared and charged. He waited until the last second, then threw himself to the side and drove the shard deep into the creature's shoulder. The monster howled, thrashing wildly. Daniel clung to its back, using every ounce of strength to keep the shard in. The beast slammed itself against a crystal tree, trying to crush him, but Daniel gritted his teeth and drove the metal deeper. Blood that glowed faint red spilled across the soil. Finally, the monster let out a final cry and collapsed with a ground-shaking thud. Daniel stumbled back, chest heaving, his clothes torn and soaked in blood and sweat. The broken shard slipped from his hand. He dropped to one knee, exhausted but alive. Slowly, he looked at the tiny aliens. They had not run. They stood there in silence, their glowing eyes fixed on him. The brave one stepped forward again, staring at the dead beast. It looked at Daniel, then dropped to its knees, pressing its tiny forehead to the ground. One by one, the others followed. The whole group bowed before him, whispering in unison. Daniel didn't understand their words, but he understood their meaning. They saw him not as a monster, not as a stranger, but as their protector. His heart pounded, not just from the fight, but from the weight of what he had done. He had defended creatures so small and fragile, yet they treated his act as something divine. They carved the moment into their hearts, their whispers full of awe. Daniel sat there, breathing hard, staring at the tiny tribe. He had only wanted to survive the crash, but in one battle, everything had changed. The little people believed he was their savior. He wasn't sure if he could live up to that, but deep inside, he knew one thing. His life was no longer his alone. Daniel did not sleep much that night. The image of the dead beast lying in the dirt haunted him, and the glowing red blood still stained his hands. The tiny aliens had brought him food, small fruits and roasted insects, but he barely touched it. He sat near the fire they made, his broken rifle across his lap, his eyes scanning the crystal forest. He knew something the tiny villagers did not. Beasts like that never came alone. If there was one, there would be another. Maybe bigger, maybe stronger, and it would come looking for revenge. The tiny aliens, however, did not seem afraid anymore. They danced around the fire, singing in their strange language. Some were carving his face into a crystal stone, their little hands working carefully. Others placed small flowers near his feet like offerings. They saw him as their savior, their guardian. Daniel wanted to tell them not to trust too much in him, but how could he? They did not understand his words, so he kept quiet, only staring into the dark forest and listening to the wind. Hours passed. The two suns set, and the forest glowed under strange blue lights that came from the crystal trees. Daniel's muscles were tense. Every sound made his hand tighten around the shard of metal he now carried as a blade. Then, just before dawn, the ground shook again. It was not the gentle shake of wind or small animals. This was heavier, angrier. The villagers froze, their eyes wide. They knew that sound. A roar split the air, louder than the one before. The trees cracked as something massive pushed through them. Daniel's heart sank. The mate had come. It was almost twice the size of the first beast, with thicker scales and glowing horns curving from its skull. Its red eyes burned with fury as it sniffed the ground, catching the scent of blood. The tiny aliens screamed and ran in circles. Mothers pulled their children close. The braver ones grabbed tiny spears, though Daniel knew they would be useless. The monster roared again and spotted the village. It lowered its head and began to charge. Daniel jumped to his feet, standing between the beast and the tribe. His broken rifle hummed weakly in his hand. He pointed it and fired. A thin blue bolt shot out, striking the monster's leg. The creature staggered but did not fall. The rifle hissed and died, smoke rising from its core. Now Daniel was truly weaponless, except for his shard of metal. He did not run. He planted his feet firmly in the dirt. The tiny aliens watched, shaking, whispering his name like a prayer. The beast thundered closer, its claws ripping the soil, its jaws wide enough to swallow him whole. Daniel waited until it leapt. Then he threw himself to the side, rolling across the dirt. The beast crashed down where he had stood, the ground exploding in dust and stone. Daniel scrambled up and slashed with his shard, cutting across the monster's neck. Sparks of glowing blood sprayed out, but the wound was shallow. The creature roared in rage and swung its tail. The tail struck Daniel hard, sending him crashing into a crystal tree. His breath burst from his chest, and pain exploded in his ribs. He gasped, forcing himself to stand again. His vision blurred, but he would not stop. The tiny aliens were behind him, cowering, helpless. If he fell, they would die. The beast lunged again. This time, Daniel ducked under its claws and drove his shard into its belly. The creature screamed, trying to shake him off, but Daniel held on. He pushed deeper, twisting the shard with all his strength. The monster slammed against the ground, rolling, trying to crush him. Daniel barely managed to pull away, diving into the dirt as the beast thrashed. His body was covered in cuts, his arms heavy with exhaustion. The tiny aliens suddenly shouted from the side. A group of them had lit torches, their little flames waving in the air. They threw them at the monster, not to hurt it, but to distract it. The beast roared, turning its head toward the tiny flames. That gave Daniel a chance. He ran forward, climbed onto its back, and drove the shard again into the thick flesh near its neck. This time he pushed until the shard broke through bone. The monster gave a final cry that echoed across the forest and collapsed with a crash that shook the ground. Silence followed. Only Daniel's heavy breathing filled the air. He slid off the beast, his hands trembling, his body aching. The shard was still buried in the monster's neck, glowing with its strange blood. Daniel fell to his knees, gasping. The tiny aliens slowly came closer. They had tears in their large eyes, their little hands trembling. Then, one by one, they bowed. The old chief stepped forward, leaning on a staff. He raised his voice, chanting in his language. The tribe repeated the chant, their voices rising higher and louder, filling the night with sound. Daniel did not understand the words, but he felt their meaning. They were honoring him. Not as a stranger, not as an enemy, but as one of their own. Daniel wanted to rest, to close his eyes, but he forced himself to stay awake. He looked at the faces of the tiny villagers, glowing in the blue light of the crystals. They were fragile, weaker than anything he had ever seen, yet they had given him their trust. And now, after 2 battles, they saw him as their protector forever. He felt the weight of it pressing on his shoulders. He had defended them twice, but deep inside, he knew more dangers would come. And every time, it would be him standing between them and death. The sun rose slowly over the strange alien sky, painting the crystal forest in red and gold. Daniel sat near the edge of the village, his body still aching from the night's battle. Every muscle screamed with pain, but he forced himself to stay upright. The tiny aliens moved around him, tending to their wounded, repairing the broken huts, and whispering prayers near the body of the slain beast. Though they were small, their voices carried far, and every time they looked at Daniel, their eyes glowed with awe and respect. He had saved them twice now. They no longer saw him as an outsider. They saw him as their shield, their protector. The old chief came forward, leaning on a staff decorated with feathers and stones. His silver skin shimmered in the sunlight, and his wide eyes reflected wisdom and age. The tribe gathered around him in silence, waiting for his words. Daniel watched carefully, not understanding their language, but knowing something important was about to happen. The chief raised both hands toward Daniel and began to speak. His voice was deep and slow, full of weight and authority. The villagers responded in unison, chanting words that Daniel could not understand, but the tone was clear. They were making a decision. The chief pointed at the dead beast, then at Daniel. He spoke again, louder this time, and the villagers cheered. Daniel felt the heat of their voices around him, their joy and relief almost overwhelming. Then, to his surprise, the chief called forward a group of young alien women, each no taller than Daniel's hand. They stood nervously before the tribe, their large eyes blinking, their small hands clutching little baskets of flowers. One of them was pushed gently forward. She was younger, her skin a softer shade of silver, her long dark hair braided with tiny crystals. She lowered her head shyly, clutching the basket so tightly it shook. The chief placed his hand on her shoulder and spoke again. His tone was serious now, almost ceremonial. The villagers fell silent, listening to his every word. Daniel frowned, confusion growing in his mind. The chief pointed at him, then at the tiny girl. The meaning was clear. Daniel's stomach dropped. They were offering her to him. The chief raised his staff high, and the tribe erupted into cheers once more. The little girl stepped forward, her eyes full of both fear and determination. She looked up at Daniel, her lips trembling as she spoke a single word, husband. Daniel froze. His breath caught in his chest, and he stared down at her in shock. Husband? No, this could not be happening. He opened his mouth to protest, but no words came out. His heart pounded, and his hands trembled. He was a soldier, a wanderer, a survivor of a crash. He had never thought of marriage, and now this tribe had just given him a wife? A wife who was no taller than his palm? The tiny villagers cheered, some throwing flower petals, others singing their strange songs. They believed this was an honor, a sacred bond. In their eyes, Daniel had defended them not once, but twice, and their law demanded that such a protector must be bound to the tribe. And the way to bind him was through marriage. The little alien girl stepped closer, bowing before him. Her small voice shook as she whispered again, "Husband." She held out the flower basket, offering it to him with trembling hands. Daniel's chest tightened. She was so small, so fragile, and yet the trust in her eyes was immense. She believed in him. She believed he would protect her, that he would never abandon her. But Daniel did not know what to do. His mind raced. If he accepted, what would it mean? Would he be trapped here forever, tied to a tribe he barely knew? If he refused, would he insult them, break their trust, and risk their hatred? His body was still weak from battle. His ship was destroyed, and he had nowhere else to go. He looked at the chief, whose old eyes glowed with expectation. He looked at the tribe, their faces full of hope. And he looked at the girl, whose tiny hands shook as she waited for his answer. He wanted to say no. Every part of him screamed that this was madness. But when he opened his mouth, nothing came out. The villagers were chanting louder now, celebrating as if the decision had already been made. The chief touched the girl's shoulder again and guided her toward Daniel. She placed the basket at his feet and then knelt, pressing her small forehead against the ground in a gesture of devotion. The villagers cheered even louder, raising their hands and chanting Daniel's name in their language. Daniel's heart pounded. He had never felt so cornered in his life. He had fought giant beasts with glowing teeth and survived, but this moment, this silent, expectant girl at his feet, terrified him more than anything else. He lifted his hand slowly, uncertain, and the girl gasped softly when his massive fingers brushed her hair. The tribe cheered again, louder than before. To them, it was done. The bond was sealed. Daniel sat frozen, stunned by what had just happened. He had not spoken a word, had not agreed, but they had already decided for him. The little alien girl looked up at him with wide eyes, whispering again in her soft, trembling voice, "Husband." And in that moment, Daniel realized his life had changed forever. He was no longer just a stranger or protector. He had been claimed by the tribe, bound by their law, tied to a tiny wife who now saw him as her world. He stared at her in silence, unsure whether to laugh, cry, or run. But deep inside, one truth burned clear. Whether he liked it or not, his fate was now tangled with hers. Daniel could not believe what had just happened. The tiny villagers were still cheering, throwing flower petals in the air, dancing around him as if the whole world had changed. The old chief looked proud, his staff raised high, his eyes glowing with certainty that his decision was right. But Daniel sat frozen, staring at the little alien girl who now stood before him. She was so small that she barely reached his wrist, and yet she carried herself with the seriousness of someone given a great duty. Her silver skin shimmered faintly under the light of the twin suns, and her braided hair sparkled with tiny crystals. She looked up at him nervously, her wide eyes full of both fear and hope. Slowly she bowed, lowering herself to her knees. Her tiny hands clutched the flower basket she had placed earlier, and her trembling voice broke the silence. "Husband," she whispered again. That single word sent a chill down Daniel's spine. He was a soldier, a wanderer, not even sure he would survive on this alien world. And now this girl, this fragile creature, was calling him husband. The tribe clapped their hands, laughing and chanting in joy. Daniel wanted to protest, but when he looked at their faces, he saw nothing but pure happiness. For them, this was not strange. This was tradition. To them, a protector of the tribe must be bound to the tribe, and the bond was sealed through marriage. If he refused, it might insult them, and worse, make them lose trust in him. The little girl raised her head, her cheeks glowing faintly as if embarrassed. She took a step closer, and Daniel saw how her small legs shook. She was scared too, but not of him. She was scared of failing the role she had been given. She whispered something in her language, her voice soft like the rustle of leaves. Then she touched his hand, her tiny fingers barely reaching across one of his knuckles. She gasped softly at the warmth of his skin, her eyes wide in awe. To her, he must have felt like a giant of stone and fire, something too big to even touch. Daniel's chest tightened. He wanted to pull his hand back, to explain that this was impossible. But when he saw her trembling, when he saw the way she looked at him with complete trust, he could not. She believed in him. She believed he would protect her, just as he had protected the tribe. And for the first time, Daniel understood that she was not just a symbol of a ritual. She was a person, a living being whose life was now tied to his. The chief spoke again, his voice booming as he declared the bond complete. The villagers cheered, lifting their tiny torches and singing in their strange melody. Some children ran forward, trying to touch Daniel's boots, laughing as if touching him brought luck. Daniel sat there, his mind a storm. He had fought beasts twice his size, survived crashes, carried wounds across battlefields. But this moment shook him more than anything else. The girl, his mini-wife, as the tribe now called her, remained close. She followed him even when he tried to step away from the crowd. Her small hands grabbed the edge of his torn jacket, and she looked up at him with wide eyes, as if afraid he would leave her behind. Daniel stopped, staring down at her. "I don't know what to do with you," he muttered under his breath, though she could not understand his words. She tilted her head, confused, but still held on to him tightly. As night fell, the villagers prepared a feast. They placed glowing fruits and roasted creatures on leaf plates, offering them to Daniel and his new wife. Daniel ate little, his body still too exhausted, but the girl sat beside him, carefully breaking tiny pieces of food and eating slowly. She glanced at him often, as if studying his every move. Then, shyly, she pushed one of her tiny fruits toward him, whispering something in her tongue. He understood the gesture. It was an offering. He accepted it with a nod, and the girl smiled for the first time, her small teeth flashing in the firelight. That smile struck him harder than the claws of any beast. She wasn't just a child obeying orders. She was trying. She wanted to do her part, to be worthy of this strange bond. Daniel felt a heavy weight settle in his chest. He had not asked for this. He did not want this. But how could he turn away from those eyes? How could he reject someone so small, so fragile, who had been given to him with complete faith? When the feast ended, the villagers guided them to a small hut built from crystal shards and woven vines. It was tiny compared to Daniel's size, clearly meant for the little aliens, but they had decorated it with flowers and glowing stones as if preparing it for a royal couple. The chief spoke a few final words and left them, the villagers bowing before they disappeared into the night. Inside the hut, Daniel sat on the ground outside because the doorway was too small for him. The girl peeked out from the entrance, her eyes nervous. She seemed to realize the size difference fully now. He was too large for her world. And yet, she stepped forward and sat near his hand, curling up beside it as if his very presence was enough to keep her safe. She whispered softly again, "Husband," before closing her eyes. Daniel stared at her in silence. She looked so peaceful, so trusting. The night air grew cold, and he wrapped his torn jacket tighter around himself. His thoughts twisted. He did not know what tomorrow would bring. More beasts? More enemies? More responsibility? He only knew one thing. This tiny alien girl, who now lay beside his hand, saw him as her protector, her family, her world. And for the first time in years, Daniel felt fear. Not of death, not of pain, but of failing her. The morning was quiet, but Daniel felt the unease in the air. The tiny village was busy. Children running between huts, women carrying water in leaf bowls, and men sharpening their small spears. Yet beneath the activity was fear. Daniel had noticed it in the chief's eyes when he spoke to him at dawn, pointing toward the horizon. There was danger coming, not from beasts this time, but from other beings, raiders. Daniel sat near the edge of the village, sharpening the shard of metal he used as a blade. His new mini-wife sat close by, her small hands holding a basket of berries. She peeked at him often, as if studying his face. Daniel tried not to think about what the chief had told him, but his soldier's instinct knew it was true. When people were desperate, they preyed on the weak, and this village of tiny aliens was as vulnerable as it could get. It happened in the afternoon. The earth trembled under heavy footsteps, not like the silent stalk of beasts, but the march of organized raiders. From the crystal forest came a band of larger aliens, towering creatures twice the height of Daniel, with gray skin and cruel eyes. Their armor was pieced together from bone and steel, their weapons sharp and heavy. They laughed when they saw the small huts, their voices echoing with malice. The tiny villagers froze. Mothers clutched their children, and the men with their thin spears trembled. The raiders sneered at the sight of them. "Insects," one of them spat, his voice like thunder. Another raised his weapon and shouted, "Slaves, food!" The tribe shivered, unable to resist. They had faced these raiders before. Daniel stood tall in front of them, his shadow falling over the trembling villagers. He stepped forward, his shard blade in hand. The raiders noticed him and laughed. "A human," one jeered. "Protecting insects? This is a joke." Another swung his weapon in the air, grinning. "Step aside, giant, or we will cut you down with them." Daniel's jaw tightened. He said nothing, only lifted the shard in warning. His heart pounded, not in fear but in rage. Behind him, he felt the tug on his torn jacket. He glanced down. His tiny wife stood there, holding onto him, her wide eyes filled with terror but also belief. She whispered his name, though she could barely pronounce it, her voice shaking like a prayer. That was enough. The raiders roared and charged. Daniel ran forward to meet them. His blade clashed against the first one, sparks flying as metal struck bone-steel armor. The impact rattled his arms, but he pushed through, slashing across the raider's chest. The alien howled and stumbled back, blood spraying across the crystal ground. The others attacked at once. Daniel fought with everything he had. He ducked under heavy swings, blocked with his shard, and struck back with raw strength. His body burned with pain. His wounds from the beasts not yet healed, but his fury gave him power. One raider tried to grab him from behind, but Daniel twisted, driving his blade into the alien's throat. Another swung down with a massive axe, and Daniel caught the handle, forcing it aside before punching the raider so hard his skull cracked against a crystal tree. But they were many, and he was only one. Sweat poured down his face, and his breath came heavy. The tiny villagers screamed and prayed, some throwing their little torches at the raiders in desperation. They could do nothing else. Daniel stood as their only wall. One of the raiders, larger than the rest, stepped forward. His eyes burned with cruelty, and in his hand was a blade longer than Daniel himself. "Enough," he growled. "You are strong, human, but you bleed the same as we do. Protecting these insects will cost you your life." Daniel wiped blood from his mouth and raised his shard again. "Then come and take it," he muttered under his breath. The leader charged, his heavy steps shaking the ground. Their blades clashed with a sound like thunder. Daniel pushed, his arms straining, his whole body screaming with effort. The raider laughed, thinking his size would win, but Daniel's rage was greater. With a roar, he twisted his blade and drove it deep into the raider's chest. The giant alien's laughter turned to a gurgle. His eyes wide in shock before he collapsed to the ground. Silence fell. The other raiders stared at their fallen leader, fear spreading in their eyes. Daniel stood over the body, blood dripping from his wounds, his chest rising and falling like a beast. He pointed his shard at them, his face hard as stone. "Leave," he growled. They understood his tone, even if they did not know his language. Slowly, they backed away, dragging their wounded, their sneers gone. The forest swallowed them once more. Daniel dropped to one knee, his strength nearly gone. His body was shaking, his arms numb. But before he could fall, he felt tiny hands on him. He looked down. His little wife had rushed forward, pressing her forehead to his arm, tears in her glowing eyes. She whispered words he could not understand, her voice breaking with emotion. Behind her, the whole tribe bowed low, chanting his name in their tongue. Daniel's chest tightened. He had not asked for this. He had not chosen this. But he had stood and fought and won. And now the tiny aliens looked at him not just as a savior, not just as a guardian, but as something more. Their only shield against a world that wanted them broken. His wife clung to him, whispering softly, and he knew one thing with certainty. He could not leave them. He had bound himself to this tribe with blood, and no force in the galaxy could change that. The days after the raid were heavy but peaceful. The tiny villagers worked together to rebuild what had been broken, singing soft songs as they carried stones and vines. Daniel helped as much as he could, lifting entire crystal beams with one arm while the little aliens tied them together with rope made from grass. To them, he was more than just a helper. He was a miracle. Children followed him everywhere, touching his boots, laughing as if he were some kind of giant toy. The elders bowed whenever he passed, their eyes full of gratitude. But the one who never left his side was the little wife the chief had given him. She was always there. When he walked through the forest, she sat on his shoulder, pointing out safe paths. When he ate, she carefully cut pieces from her own plate and offered them to him, smiling shyly when he accepted. At night, when the village slept, she curled up near his hand, whispering soft words in her language before drifting into dreams. She had begun learning his words too. She repeated simple ones he taught her, her small voice shaky but eager. "Food," she would say, holding a berry up to him. "Safe," she whispered when she pointed to the huts. And sometimes she practiced the word husband, her face glowing as if the word itself was precious. Daniel felt torn. Part of him wanted to laugh at the absurdity of it all. He was a soldier, a wanderer, never meant to settle. And now he had a wife so tiny she could hide in his pocket. Yet every time she looked at him with those wide eyes, full of trust and devotion, something stirred in his chest. Something he had not felt in years. She believed in him. She depended on him. And somehow, that mattered more than he wanted to admit. But fear followed close behind. Every time he remembered the beasts, every time he thought of the raiders, his stomach tightened. What if he failed next time? What if he was not there when they needed him? The thought of his little wife crying over his body, Or worse, being taken by raiders, made his hands tremble. He had fought many battles, faced death more times than he could count, but this feeling, this fear of losing someone else, was new, and it terrified him. One evening, as the twin suns sank and the sky turned purple, the chief called for him. The old alien spoke slowly, his voice low and heavy with meaning. Daniel could not understand all the words, but he understood enough. The chief placed his hand on Daniel's chest and then pointed to the village, to the huts, to the children playing in the dust. His meaning was simple. You are ours now. You are our guardian. The tribe chanted softly, agreeing with their leader, their glowing eyes fixed on him with expectation. Daniel nodded, but inside his mind twisted. He had no ship, no way off this world, no clear path home. Maybe he was theirs now, whether he liked it or not. His little wife appeared from behind the chief, her small face glowing with hope. She clutched Daniel's finger with both her hands, holding it tightly to her chest as if she would never let go. He could not speak her language, but in that moment, he understood her perfectly. She was not afraid anymore, because she believed he would never leave her. That night, as the village slept, Daniel sat outside their small hut, staring at the stars. His wife sat beside him, her tiny legs dangling over the edge of a stone. She leaned against his arm, humming a soft song. He listened, his chest heavy, and finally whispered, "Why me?" Of course, she could not answer. She only looked up at him, smiling gently, and whispered his name. It was the first time she had said it clearly, and it cut straight through his heart. The days grew warmer. The girl began copying his movements, trying to learn his ways. She watched him sharpen his shard and tried to sharpen her tiny spear the same way. She watched him carry logs and tried to drag small sticks to impress him. Sometimes she tripped, sometimes she failed, but every time Daniel helped her up, her eyes shone with determination. She was learning not just from her people, but from him. She wanted to be stronger. She wanted to stand beside him, even though her size made it impossible. One afternoon, he found her crying quietly near the river. Her small hands clutched the water, and her shoulders shook. Daniel crouched, frowning, unsure how to comfort her. She looked up at him, her face wet with tears, and whispered one word, "Weak." The sound of it broke him. She thought she was too weak to stand beside him, too small to ever protect him the way he protected her. Without thinking, Daniel reached down and lifted her gently onto his palm. She gasped, surprised, but did not resist. He held her close to his chest, shaking his head. "No," he said firmly, "not weak." She blinked, staring into his eyes, and though she did not understand every word, she felt the meaning. Her tears slowed, and a small smile crept onto her lips. She placed her tiny hand against his chest, right over his heart, and whispered, "Strong, together." Daniel swallowed hard. She was right. They were bound, not just by the chief's decision, but by something deeper. He could not push her away, not anymore. She had become his anchor in this strange world, just as he had become her shield. But deep inside, the fear still lived. The world was cruel, filled with beasts and raiders and storms. He had strength now, but strength could fail, and if it did, he would lose more than his own life. He would lose hers. That thought haunted him every night. As the stars glowed above the crystal forest, Daniel lay awake, his little wife curled near his hand, her breathing soft and steady. He closed his eyes, whispering silently to himself. He had fought for duty, for survival, for orders, but now, for the first time in his life, he had something else to fight for. Something small, something fragile, something he could never allow himself to lose. The sky darkened with heavy clouds, and the air grew thick and heavy. Daniel felt the change before the storm even began. The wind howled through the crystal trees, bending them until they creaked like old bones. The tiny villagers looked up with fear, their wide eyes glowing in the dim light. They had seen storms before, but nothing like this. The chief's face was grim as he pointed to the horizon. A wall of black clouds rolled toward them, flashing with strange green lightning. This was not just a storm, it was destruction. The tiny aliens rushed about, trying to secure their fragile huts with rope and stone, but Daniel knew it would not be enough. Their homes were too small, too weak to stand against a storm that shook the very earth. His chest tightened. If the winds tore through here, the whole village would be gone. He could not let that happen. "Inside!" Daniel shouted, even though they could not understand his words. His voice and gestures carried the meaning. The villagers hurried to gather their children, running toward the caves on the far side of the village. But the storm was already upon them. The wind screamed, tearing branches from trees and hurling them through the air. The rain came down like knives, sharp and cold, stinging his skin. One of the huts began to collapse, its roof ripping away into the sky. The people inside screamed. Without hesitation, Daniel rushed forward. He grabbed the crystal beams with both arms, holding them together as the wind tried to tear them apart. His muscles strained, his back burned with pain, but he held firm until the family inside escaped. They ran toward the caves, bowing as they passed, their voices lost in the roar of the storm. Again and again, Daniel threw himself into the chaos. He pulled down trees that threatened to fall on the huts. He lifted beams and pressed them back into place while villagers scrambled to safety. His hands bled, his shoulders screamed, but he did not stop. Behind him, his little wife followed as best she could, shouting in her tiny voice, waving to guide villagers towards safety. Her hair was soaked, her face pale, but she did not leave his side. The storm grew worse. The ground flooded, mud sucking at his boots as he fought to keep his footing. Lightning struck nearby, splitting a tree into glowing shards. The thunder was so loud it shook his bones. Daniel's heart raced, but he refused to fall. The tribe was his now. Their lives depended on him. At last, most of the villagers reached the caves, their glowing eyes peering out from the dark safety. But the chief called out, pointing with desperation. 2 huts remained, full of frightened children who were too scared to move. Daniel roared and charged into the storm again. The wind slammed against him, the rain blinding his vision, but he forced himself forward. He tore open the huts and lifted the children into his arms, shielding them with his body as he fought his way back to the caves. When he finally stumbled inside, dropping to one knee, the villagers erupted into cheers. They surrounded him, touching his arms, chanting his name, their voices shaking with both fear and joy. He had saved them once more. But the storm was not finished. A deafening crack split the sky, and Daniel turned to see a massive crystal tree falling directly toward the cave entrance. If it blocked the opening, the villagers would be trapped inside forever. Without thinking, Daniel ran back into the rain. His wife screamed his name, but he did not stop. He planted his feet in the mud, raised both hands, and caught the tree as it fell. The weight was crushing. His arms quaked, his knees buckled, and pain shot through every bone. The wind pushed harder, the storm screaming in his ears. For a moment, he thought he would break, but then he heard them, the voices of the tribe, shouting his name, calling him their guardian. And then, softer but stronger, he heard her voice, his little wife. She was crying, but her voice rose above the storm, whispering his name with all the strength she had. Daniel roared, pushing with everything inside him. His muscles tore, his back screamed, but he refused to give in. Slowly, inch by inch, he shifted the tree aside, guiding it down into the mud so it no longer blocked the cave. He collapsed forward, his chest heaving, his vision fading from exhaustion. The storm raged through the night, but the villagers were safe inside the caves. And when the first light of dawn broke through the clouds, the world was quiet again. The storm had passed, leaving broken trees and ruined huts, but the people were alive. Daniel sat in the mud, his body shaking, his clothes torn and soaked. His little wife ran to him, her tiny arms wrapping around his finger as tears streamed down her face. She pressed her forehead to his skin and whispered a single word, "Home." The chief came forward, leaning on his staff. He spoke slowly, his voice heavy with emotion. The villagers knelt as one, their glowing eyes fixed on Daniel. He had not only defended them from beasts and raiders, but now from the fury of nature itself. To them, he was no longer just a protector. He was family. Daniel stared at them all, his heart heavy but steady. He had never asked for this life, never imagined himself tied to a tribe of tiny aliens. Yet here he was, their shield, their savior, their guardian. He looked down at the girl clinging to him, her small smile shining through tears. In her eyes, he saw no doubt. To her, he was everything. And in that moment, Daniel understood. His life was no longer his own. It belonged to them, to this tribe, to this girl, to this fragile world that had trusted him completely. He had been given something far greater than he ever expected. Not just survival, but a home worth defending with his last breath.